This week we got a lore bomb about the ancient kingdom, which was in its prime 900 years ago, a hint about Logia awakenings and what they could look like, and Film Red hit theaters this weekend in a whole bunch of places all over the world. So I've seen the movie, and to me it just felt like I was watching an animated playlist that had been glued together by little bits and pieces of exposition here and there. The best scene in the movie is the one that the color page in this chapter is depicting. That and the credits. I enjoyed the credits. I definitely don't think it's the best One Piece movie, but I definitely don't think it's the worst One Piece movie either. If somebody doesn't know anything about One Piece and they're going into this movie thinking that this movie is going to be their gateway into the series, I think that's a mistake. That being said, this is a movie that exists that you can definitely buy a ticket for if you want to watch it. It's that kind of movie. It's flashy, it has a bunch of special effects and colors, and there's some hype moments, some action moments. But all of those things are just kind of there to distract you from the fact that the actual script of the movie, the actual story of the film, doesn't have a whole lot of substance to it.
That being said, one of the things that I think the film does well, in addition to some of the songs, is that it presents the Straw Hats as a crew, right? It shows us the group dynamics of the Straw Hats, which, by the way, we also get in this chapter as well.
The chapter starts off with Zoro and Brook explaining that they decided to stay behind in case somebody decided to ambush the crew. They would be there to bail them out. Caribou is there with them as well, and so the topic then becomes about how he helped Luffy out in Wano, specifically in Udon, and he also fed Luffy after Kaido threw him out of Onigashima. So the agreement was that Caribou would leave Wano with the Straw Hats in exchange for his services. So after the debt is paid, Zoro just kind of tells him to off, which is definitely going to lead to some complication later down the road because Caribou has knowledge about the location of two ancient weapons, and if he happens to find out anything about Uranus in this arc, then he's going to have knowledge about all three. And so it depends on who he shares that knowledge with, but it could create some conflict later down the road.
We find out that the entirety of Egghead Island runs on fire, which I believe could be a reference to chapter 1060, when Nami mentions that the warm eddy that they find Bonney in is actually a mass of warm water that got heated up somewhere and pushed into the surface.
Also, the premise of fire being the island's energy source might help us understand where the pyroblowing comes from that we learned about last chapter, that is used to create the Sky Island clouds, because we know that pyroblowing has to come from volcanoes. Now, Lilith says that she would like to get her hands on an eternal flame, on Amaterasu. She wants the power of the sun in the palm of her hand. And so this takes me back to something I mentioned during the Luffy versus Kaido fight, because after Luffy awakened his Devil Fruit, Kaido mentioned that Luffy's awakening was 2 in 1. It seemed to have features of a Zoan awakening combined with features of a Paramecia awakening, because Luffy could turn his surroundings into rubber. And so now I'm thinking that if Luffy's going to get all three types of awakening, if he's going to get 3 in 1, then maybe him producing an eternal flame is what his Logia type of awakening would look like. So if he's able to create a sustainable source of energy, like a fire that never goes out, I think that would be a perfect explanation for what Logias are capable of doing if they are awakened. It actually goes back to the fight in Punk Hazard where Akainu fought Aokiji, and so maybe both admirals are awakened Logia users, and because of that, they changed the weather of the island permanently. So maybe if you're an awakened Logia, what the awakening allows you to do is to create an everlasting version of your element. This also goes back to Whitebeard's final speech when he says that somebody will show up that will inherit Ace's will. Because even if you break the bloodline, if you try to kill it, the will still get inherited. Whitebeard uses the phrase that you'll never be able to extinguish their flame. So again, the whole concept of the eternal flame coming into play in regards to Luffy, who just so happened to end up being the sun god. So maybe that's why Lunarians have this flame on their back, because Nika at one point used his awakening to give them that power of fire, a flame that would never go out. I read a comment a while back that said that maybe that's what happened to the minks, and maybe that explains why the minks can use electro, because maybe the ancient user of the Goro Goro no Mi, the ancient user of Enel's Devil Fruit, awakened the Devil Fruit and granted the minks the power of electricity. So they were granted an electric charge that would never go out, that would withstand time and be passed down through the future generations of minks.
The official translation's dialogue for this is actually very intriguing, so I'm just going to read it to you. This is Lilith saying, "The island's power source is fire. Fire can be converted into all types of energy. I've long researched what can be burned for energy, and I thought if only there was such a thing as an undying flame, we could create our own sun. And so a question I've had ever since Nika was introduced is, why was he called the sun god in the first place? Was Nika able to create an eternal flame that eventually turned into the sun? Did Nika create the sun? And it also relates to the minks as well, because the minks, their Sulong form, right, activates by looking at the full moon. So they draw the energy from the moon in a sense. And we all know that the moon cannot shine by itself, because moonlight is just the moon reflecting the light that it gets from the sun. It's also a great contrast between Luffy and Teach, because the sun has the power to sustain life and energy, whereas darkness has the power to turn everything into nothing and destroy.
The metal gate that the Straw Hats walk through, I thought was interesting. It kind of reminded me of like platform 9 3/4 from Harry Potter. It also kind of reminded me of like Wapple's double fruit power and how he can essentially digest anything. And so, I don't know, I'm wondering if the gate is made out of like a special type of Wapple metal. Now, the Straw Hats are essentially walking into a test room. And the moment I saw the Seraphim Jinbe, I was immediately reminded of a cover page that Oda drew. It's the one for chapter 10-12. And it has Kid on it. And he's building a mechanical bird. And the bird has a number on it. I'm assuming it's the number of the model, right? So in this case, it's 81. Just like the Jinbe Seraphim has a number 4. And if you look above the number 4, it also has a percentage on it, which is 98%. Well, in the Kid cover page, Kid also has a percentage number on his apron, and that's 99%. So I alluded to this in my previous video, but the odds of there being a connection between Kid and Vegapunk just keep on increasing. Seraphim Jinbe uses his Kizaru laser to shoot at the Straw Hats, creates an explosion and pushes them back. Nami doesn't want to hurt children, so she tells Zeus to stand by. That goes into one of the main themes for Nami's character, which is the motherly theme. And then Frankie is shocked to find out that the Jinbe Seraphim can make use of Senior Pink's double fruit power. Now, there's only two possible explanations for why Seraphim Jinbe can have Senior Pink's double fruit power. The first, which I think is not likely, is that Senior Pink died and his double fruit got reborn, and Vegapunk fed that double fruit power to the Jinbe Seraphim, but I don't think it's likely. The other possible explanation for this, which I believe is the correct one, comes from the SBS of volume 99, because in it, Oda explains how Caesar is able to make smileys. Oda says that Caesar uses the lineage factor from various living animals to create these double fruits. He says that's why gifters with the same animal exist, and why ability users for Logia, Paramecia, or mythical Zoans cannot appear, since lineage factors can only be extracted from already existing organisms. This is Caesar's limit as a scientist. However, the genius scientist Vegapunk might or might not have been able to research beyond that boundary. Now, despite Oda's attempt to try to be vague, we already know with absolute certainty that Vegapunk was 100% capable of breaking that limit, because he created Momonosuke's double fruit, which is a mythical type Zoan. Granted, he did call the double fruit a failure, according to the government, but I feel like that's a lie. He just didn't want the government to have it. I also feel like that's why ZP0 wants to kill Vegapunk in the first place, because Green Bull fought Momonosuke and he realized that the fruit was a success and that Vegapunk had lied to the government. Also, the newest SBS section for volume 104 heavily implies that this character is still alive, despite Kaido's attempt to murder him, or at the very least, he was still alive long enough to take a picture of Sun God Nika Luffy. Regardless, the main point here is that since we know that Vegapunk is capable of creating artificial mythical type Zoans, there is no reason for why he should not be able to create artificial Paramecias. So I think Seraphim Jinbe ate an artificial replica of Senior Pink's double fruit power that Vegapunk made. Because we know that Doflamingo and his crew got arrested by the Marines after Dressrosa, so maybe Vegapunk was able to get a sample from Senior Pink to be able to recreate his devil fruit. Now, something I noticed is that when Seraphim Jinbe pops out of the quote-unquote floor water to choke Nami, his flame on his back is gone. And so that's a feature that we know Lunarians have, that they can sacrifice the flame on their back for more speed in exchange for less durability, less defense. So after he pops out of the water with no flame, that means that Jinbe is faster, but he's a lot less durable. So Sanji gets a kick in, and the pacifista gets sent back, because again, he does not have the durability that he usually should have. Robin tries to get in a hit as well, but because of the Seraphim's double fruit power and speed boost, he's able to dodge it. So he comes at Robin with a Fishman karate pose, which Usopp takes note of, and he gets the Seraphim in the face with Midoriboshi, skull exploding grass. Now, even when Seraphim Jinbe Jinbe pops up from behind Usopp to grab him, you can clearly tell that his flame is still not on. Frankie takes aim at the Seraphim with his scope and shoots out a radical beam, which takes Mr. Edison, also known as Punk number 3, by surprise.
I found it interesting that the punks just get surprised at Frankie using a beam. The fact that they're so surprised over Frankie using a beam is interesting. So it kind of reminded me of the technology that Emu used to erase the kingdom of Lulusia, which was a bunch of beams falling from the sky. So it gets me to think that the government used that same weapon to wipe out the Lunarians into extinction, that maybe Lunarians are weak to beams or something. Or maybe they're just weak to lasers when they're children, and maybe the government is responsible for killing a whole bunch of Lunarian kids. Because this is what Edison says: "That was a close one. The Seraphim are still children. They're not ready for laser tests yet." And then after that, Lilith says, "You can say that again. Do you have any idea how much a Seraphim costs? I ought to twist your heads off." But the point here is that it's heavily implied that Frankie's laser could have severely hurt or damaged the Jinbe Seraphim. And so maybe that statement is suggesting that Lunarian children, Lunarian kids, have a weakness to lasers. Now in that scene with Lilith and Edison, there's like a globe in the background with white spheres, but there almost seems to be like a path, because there's like a line connecting some of those circles. So I'm wondering, like, are those supposed to be planets? Is that a constellation? Because all of those white spheres are within the area of the globe. So I'm thinking that maybe these are like satellites, or maybe even sky islands, and maybe the thing that's connecting them is sort of there to represent a sky path.
So we enter the section of the chapter that introduces us to the punk vessels that we hadn't seen yet. And something that gets hinted at by Edison and then confirmed by Pythagoras is that the plan is to make the Seraphims older at some point. However, the punks are not really sure about how they're going to be doing that, because Pythagoras says that that will create some complications, and so it's pretty obvious that Bonney's going to come into play and use her ability on the Seraphims at some point. So I feel like there could be an agreement where Vegapunk asks Bonney, like, if you age up the Seraphims and give me a full adult roster of the Seraphims that I've created from the Shichibukai, I will restore your father's mind. I will bring him back, get his mind back so that he goes back to normal if you age up the Seraphim. Now, two of the potential matchups that I would really like to see here would be Sanji versus adult Seraphim Doflamingo. I think it'd be kind of cool to get a rematch of what happened in Dressrosa. And then the second matchup I would really like to see using the Seraphims would be Zoro versus adult Seraphim Mihawk. I feel like that would be a great test. Now, according to Redon, Pythagoras' design is actually a reference to a Japanese TV show that aired in the 1970s called Gambare Robocon. So they had a character that looked like this in the series. In the chapter, though, we can see that his head is detachable because he gives a little jump when he wants to go to the bathroom. So yeah, it just feels like he's just a little ball that's attached to a giant body.
By the way, after Lilith's comment about wanting to twist the other punks' heads off, Edison gets a eureka moment, and he says that he has a new idea for a brand new invention. And so I'm assuming that Lilith's comment about detachable heads is what gave Edison the idea in the first place. So maybe he's gonna just, be able to detach all of the other punks' heads, or maybe create a detachable head for Stella, Vegapunk's main body, or something like that. Regardless, no matter what the invention is, no matter what the idea is that he got, that has to pay off. Like, we have to see it, come to fruition, or sort of see the invention at some point. There's no point in him going off to build something new if we're not going to see what it is.
Finally, we get introduced to punk number 6, which is York, and it seems like she's responsible for all of the bodily functions of the other punks. So I guess all of the other punks don't really have to eat or go to the bathroom or rest. I'm actually kind of grateful about how fast Oda was to reveal the appearances of these other bodies, of these other punks. Because I think back to Wano and I just cringe at how long it took him to reveal all of the numbers. Every so often we would get a new design and it just took forever and they were a complete disappointment. So I'm really grateful for Egghead's pacing, even though we didn't get to see Blackbeard versus Law continue in this chapter. But it's just one chapter. If we don't get an update about that fight in 2 or 3 chapters, then that's a problem. But for now, it's fine. Something else we don't get to see is the continuation of Shaka's conversation with Dragon. He just kind of shows up to stop the Seraphim from attacking the Straw Hats. And again, his Daft Punk helmet just reminds me a lot of Killer's helmet. So the Kid and Vegapunk connections just keep coming up. And that's not even counting the magnetic field that Shaka mentions can disable the Dom shoes. We cut over to the lower level to find that Luffy has found a pipe like the one that him and his brothers would use when they were growing up together. And so at the junkyard, they also find a mysterious suit of armor, big enough for a giant, Or maybe it's a giant robot. Regardless, the helmet looks very Viking-like, so I'm automatically left to make connections to Elbaf, which I'm sure will be the next island that we visit after Egghead. Turns out that Egghead is a microcosm of what the ancient kingdom used to look like 900 years ago. So back then we had Lunarians, Sky Islands, and giant warriors roaming the earth. And so this automatically adds more credibility to the theory that Joy Boy was a giant, and that the giant straw hat that we saw back in Marijoa actually belonged to Joy Boy. It's also why when Luffy's fighting Kaido and he goes Gear 5th, he actually turns into a giant. People speculate that that's actually Joy Boy's original size, that he was huge.
It also seems like the ancient giant has like a katana stuck on its abdomen, or kind of stabbing it through the abdomen. So I thought it was fascinating how the more lore we get, the more information we get about the ancient kingdom, the more we can tie some of those themes back to the Straw Hats. In the beginning of the video, I talked about the concept of the eternal flame, the inherited will, the fire that never goes out, which to me relates to Luffy, as well as Joy Boy / Nika. Throughout the entire chapter, Frankie is very impressed by the technological advancements that he sees in Egghead. So that relates to his character. And then we find out that they're not technically, advancements, but that the ancient past had this technology already. So this relates to history, which connects this to Robin as well. We have an ancient giant warrior there in the junkyard, which connects this to Usopp. The giant also has a katana, which connects it to Zoro. Like I said before, we have a giant globe, or a globe there that seems to be some kind of a map, which relates to Nami. A couple of chapters ago, we also learned about the cooking machine and how the goal here is to mass produce them, right? So that you can feed a whole bunch of people, which relates to Sanji.
It's all coming together.
So I'm guessing that at some point we're going to find out that the ancient kingdom had a type of medicine that was so advanced that it could cure any disease. So I think all of those factors together are a very clear indicator that the story is shifting towards, okay, how do we build a future with the knowledge of the past? How do we get those advancements, the technology, and that world back that existed in the past that was destroyed by the world government? How do we get it back? How do we get back those good things of the past and have them grow and have them build in the present so that we can create a more advanced and better future? I feel like maybe that's what the One Piece is, and maybe that's why Roger wanted or needed the ancient weapons to create a new world, but he was too early. So maybe the One Piece is the key to unlocking the knowledge about how to create the ancient kingdom of the past, but create it in the present. And maybe not just recreating what existed in the past, but actually building something that surpasses the greatness of what existed before. Maybe the mission after finding the One Piece is to create an even better kingdom by the end of the series. As I kind of alluded to before, I really enjoyed the crew dynamic in this chapter. There's a couple of humorous moments there with Usopp. First with his comment about Nami wanting jewelry and equating that to the desires of an old lady, and then him claiming to be Vegapunk. Near the end of the chapter, Frankie has a line that again makes me think that he might want to stay a little bit longer in Egghead than the rest of the crew, because he says he wants to wander around to see everything, to learn more about the tech being used. I also noticed that in the fight against Seraphim Jinbe, Robin's attack is using Dragon Claw, which is Sabo's signature move. I also thought it was funny how Luffy says that the ancient giant that they find is not a hollow, meaning that it's not a hologram, but the hollow is actually the name of Perona's devil fruit power. And finally, the last bit of information that really jumped out at me from this chapter is that we learned that the bloodline element, or the lineage factor of human or living things from the past, actually contain memories in it, right? So Pythagoras says, does that mean that bloodline elements record individual experiences? So it feels like the memory can be passed down via the lineage factor, which isn't really new if you think about Luffy's awakening and how like Luffy's personality when he first awakened the Nika fruit started to change, and it seemed like he was acting like somebody else, in this case Joy Boy. But it's good to have confirmation, at least to some extent, that devil fruits could carry memories of the past. So maybe that's why devil fruits started being called devil fruits by the government, because since the government thinks itself to be a god Anybody who's an enemy of the government is the devil, and maybe some devil fruits have memories of the past that belong to the people of the ancient kingdom. And this whole idea of being able to preserve memories is a fundamental aspect of the series. In fact, Memories is the name of the very first ending of the anime, and then it's played again in the anime when we see Roger reach Laugh Tale and find out about the past. So that's why Seraphim Jinbe is capable of using Fishman Karate, and it's also why Seraphim Mihawk can use the sword or use sword attacks similar to Mihawk as well, because the memory gets preserved via the lineage factor or the blood element, aka the DNA. And if you remember, the way that Vegapunk was able to create Kaido's artificial devil fruit was by extracting the blood element or the lineage factor from Kaido. So again, there's some evidence that suggests that devil fruits might contain memories of the past, at least to some degree or capacity, which, by the way, brings me back to the verse in Binks Sake that says, "It's time to ship out Binks's brew, wave goodbye, but don't you cry, our memories remain." That's going to do it for me today, guys. Thank you for watching. Thank you for all of your support. Take care. Have a great week. Catch you later. Bye.